Yiridu Marang. Good day. My name is Tammi Giselle. I'm a Marawari and Wiradjuri woman, and I would like to acknowledge that I'm calling in today on the unceded lands of the Bidjigal people, one of the 29 clans of the Great Eora Nation in the lands now known as Sydney, Australia. I acknowledge all Bidjigal people who've come before me, those that are here now and those that will come in the future. I give thanks to you for your enduring care of country, community and culture. Thank you for having me here today. I'm so thrilled to be able to share with you some of the findings from the recent Critical Path Indigenous Dramaturgy and Dance project. Across 2021 and 2022, Critical Path Dance Research Australia created space for research in the framework of a fully engaged and really culturally grounded approach to considering and supporting Indigenous Australian dramaturgies in dance. Spearheaded by First Nations producer Jasmine Goulash and director Claire Hicks, who place the development of the program in the hands of the Indigenous Australian choreographic community, whereby emerging, mid-career, established and senior dancers gather to share perspectives on what is Indigenous dramaturgy in dance. The project developed through a series of knowledge circle conversations in spring 2021, followed by an event in summer 2022, which opened the activity to the wider sector, whereby Indigenous dancers were invited to apply for action research residencies. 4 such residencies took place in June 2022, exploring the concept of dramaturgy generally, as well as the role of dramaturgy in dance making. Further, the participants looked at how, as a distinct methodology or application, dramaturgy informed their work as Indigenous Australian dance practitioners. The aims of the Indigenous Dramaturgy and Dance project were to develop dialogue around contemporary Indigenous Australian dramaturgy and dance, to support Indigenous Australian dance creatives to explore the ideas underpinned by contemporary Indigenous dramaturgy, to address the issue of having to work within Western frameworks, for example, whether to utilise a dramaturge at all, to clarify Indigenous Australian dramaturgy and dance, to initiate dialogue to nurture new and innovative forms, and to open conversation with non-Indigenous producers and presenters of innovative Australian dance. I do just want to point out here that I will use the terms First Nations and Indigenous interchangeably, and in doing so I refer to all of the First Peoples who come from right across this great land now known as Australia. This was such a poignant moment throughout the project, and a really, really important question. Why would we think that? Well, throughout this project, I began to really formulate the idea that one small part of the answer, at least, is that we are persistently reckoning the freedoms afforded by contemporary dance experimentation against the sacred weight of culture. And because of this, our practices and our performance formats adapt place to place, and they adapt person to person, permission to permission, and essentially project to project. So it was really, really timely and fitting for Critical Path to gather us all together to really have a look at what dramaturgy is as a process distinct from the choreographic. And in doing so, we've really taken a deep dive into what dramaturgy traditionally is and does. We reflected on working with Indigenous and non-Indigenous dramaturgs and those that are external to the dancer and choreographer. We've asked what it is to work without them too. We've examined working with dramaturgs who come from a dance background and working with those who do not. But most seriously, we have assessed the dramaturgical responsibilities and authorities and how these inform our work as Indigenous storytellers. In doing so, we have discovered a great wealth of thought leadership from Indigenous dance practitioners internationally, which has guided us in consideration and articulation of our findings. In particular, for myself, in summarising the findings of this work, I found the groundbreaking work by Smlodem Newsome, Dr. Mikkel Dangeli, on her offering of dance sovereignty to be extraordinarily helpful. It's important for me to make the distinction early on in this talk that story refers to an enduring record of our people, a record born of the perpetual interplay between people and place, of community and country. Our stories are carried through time, in song, in design and in dance, as embodied animate archives recorded each and every single day. Because of this, a great many of our stories are very, very old. Others are relatively new when considered in the scheme of things since the ever first sunset. There are scores of Indigenous stories yet to be discovered, experienced, recorded. Each story is valid to our sense of culture, community, country, and each is ever ripe for reliving and remembering because the body is central to all action of recording and representing our histories. Our duty as dancers, then, is essential to the survival of our stories, our histories, the old and the new, actualised in the present, embodied to remain relevant and accessible. We realised pretty quickly that to consider dramaturgy here was to re-evaluate the why, the how, and for whom our dances are created. We did so with an open-hearted vigour, and this enabled us to confront so much of what we regarded as culturally and professionally dear. We began to ask, who oversees what we do, and why? What processes are applied, and why? Thankfully, dramaturgy, as a process in and of itself, has been shown to hold potential responsibility across numerous aspects of a work depending on that project. And this has allowed us to identify primary concerns as they specifically apply to Indigenous Australian dance making and performance practices. Key reflections for this group have centred upon and consistently circled back to connection, responsibility, and trust. Connection, responsibility, and trust. Connection to country, connection to community, connection to story. Responsibility to country, responsibility to community, and responsibility to story. Trust of country, trust of community, trust of culture, trust of story, your part in it and our part in it. Indigenous dramaturgy as a process of trust and authentic connection is beautifully expressed by Butchulla and Yagara dramaturge Kamara Bell Wykes when she writes, First Nations dramaturgy, like all artistic and cultural practices, is not a fixed entity, but something that evolves and adapts over time according to the context it occurs in and the people involved. As Indigenous dance creatives working principally in non-verbal, non-literal, non-linear, chronologically all-encompassing modalities of storytelling, we become and compose literal figures of speech. Our realm of story exists between the lines of narrative. We may only ever inhabit as fleshy metaphors in motion. We acknowledge the value of an outside eye in this endeavour. Whether this role should necessarily be described as dramaturg is contentious, for the authority this role is perceived to have in bringing story to stage in the Western theatre tradition. Language matters. We are dancers, we are choreographers, whose collective work spans the spectrum of performance possibility, and our accountabilities extend far beyond packing an audience, receiving 5-star reviews, or the promise of further funding. Deciding how an Indigenous story should or could be danced anywhere, let alone within theatrical or dramatic dance contexts, is serious business. It's commonly accepted in the Western contemporary dance milieu that as artists we do not need to explain ourselves, that we may be as experimental and as visionary and as exploratory and as imaginative as we see fit. And in some circumstances this may well be true. However, for Indigenous Australian dance creatives, this is not always the case for the protocols inherent to being an animate archive of your people. Equally, we highlight that our dance creatives may have further layers of personal cultural commitments which inform their creative processes beyond those demanded by a specific story. Therefore, it resounds that any technique of dramatic composition and theatrical representation, such as dramaturgy, which is employed in the service of Indigenous Australian dance, must serve the cultural knowledge contained in that story, as well as the cultural obligations carried by the Indigenous dance creatives involved in physicalising it. Again, we ask, who oversees our work and why? What processes are applied and why? A dramaturg, as we have come to see it, is the one who knows the story or the script inside out, and who can spin it like labyrinth twine, creating tension and slack, leading performer and audience home to theatrical resolution. The dramaturg is the one responsible for metering out the drama and fundamentally the principal decision maker on how this story is going to be told. The keeper of story, the master of yarn. The notion of a keeper of story, or the master of yarn, really presents a challenge for us in that a keeper of story is recognised as having the knowledge and the cultural authority to determine what is important and what is contextually appropriate to highlight, what better to conceal so only those with cultural knowing will see it, and certainly what not to reveal at all. We recognise this potent responsibility in the one who lays out the physical, spatial, energetic and resultant temporal landscapes which dancer and audience navigate separately, yet simultaneously through the dance event. This responsibility is overseen by a keeper of story, then developed, realised and maintained in cohort with the choreographer and dance performers. At times, a keeper of story, choreographer and performer are one and the same. And this offers its own set of process performative commitments and external guide requirements, as do improvisation-based Indigenous dance pursuits. What then is a dramaturge for us, as opposed to a knowing and authorised outside eye? We hold this as a person or persons we trust, or who is trusted culturally and professionally to add value to what is present already. Our motivations and presentations must vary from place to place, person to person, project to project, permission to permission for these reasons. Cultural obligations are easily interrupted through the imposition of Western theatrical models upon our work as Indigenous Australian storytellers. It is essential to understand that protocols around ownership and custodianship of story govern much decision-making in our work. Any person in this role in our dance spaces must be someone who can speak to our work and offer, I saw, I heard, I felt, in culturally appropriate and relevant ways. This work supports the dance creative in accessing their full senses, to challenge thinking and moving in ways which will ensure cultural safety and integrity across process, performance and beyond. We have realised that vital dramaturgical considerations and many of the processes embedded in dramaturgy are completed as a course of duty throughout the cultural, choreographic, creative development of our works, and that this work is often guided by more than one person in roles such as elder, traditional owner, traditional knowledge keeper, cultural advisor, cultural provocateur, language consultant, mentor, and trusted fellow artist or community member, to name but a few. Language matters, so what do we want to call this person? What name shall we give this role? This manner of working collectively with protocol and negotiating proper action aligns with the concept of dancing sovereignty as offered by Dr. Michele D'Angeli. She writes, Dancing sovereignty is the theatrical framework I have created to critically engage the ways in which sovereignty is embodied in Northwest Coast First Nations dance practices through complex negotiations and responsive assertions of protocol, bodies of law which form Indigenous legal systems, both in the creation of performances and of performances themselves. We ask, should an external dramaturg carry the weight of this responsibility? And if so, in which circumstances? Our stories are here, there, everywhere. Our stories are then, now, everywhen. Our storytellers respond to the scripts of our people and places. These are the old stories and new stories, law stories, creation stories, all teaching stories passing through us and through time, and they each contain all the plot, theme, character, dialogue, rhythm, and potential for spectacle essential to be enacted theatrically. However, it is particularly the modification of language flow through script editing which causes much debate in the context of Indigenous Australian dance dramaturgies. In this case, the editing of movement language, for example, gestures, postures, transitions, travelling, formations, and other phrases within the cultural script to be refined. Indigenous dance demands that this work be completed with absolute precision, for in many cases a single word in a traditional language and or its equivalent gesture can equate an entire philosophy. Flesh metaphors edited by an individual without the requisite knowledge and cultural authority have significant effects on the work and the practitioner. The justification for any element of our stories to be shared or kept, or whether it will be performed publicly and under what circumstances, and further how these are offered and received conflicts with Western models of theatrical presentation. For example, the royalties due for the adaptation of Indigenous story through dance are well beyond the financial and remain long due past closing night. These are determined by complex cultural, community, generational, genetic connections between the dance creative to the story and to the people and the place where the story belongs. As mentioned earlier, individual as well as collective cultural obligations beyond the specific story yet still holding significant cultural relevance to the artist can also deeply inform creative choices. This makes responsibility to story or to the script differ greatly from our non-Indigenous colleagues as we are rarely working off an arbitrary script or responding in a purely character-driven way, nor are we stepping out of our Indigenous bodies to perform contemporary dance in a vacuum. The ancestors dance with us always. We are always accountable to them.
Start to think about in the context of the conversations that we've been having about what it is to have a dramaturg or an outside eye, someone who's actually an editor on the story. And I was wondering how that would even be possible for someone who didn't have the eyes to see the gestures and the footwork and to be able to start to know the story, know where the story's at least, or what's happening. There's so much information that's implicit within the gestures and the postures that were I not a dancer or had been trained in the ways that we've been trained, there's no way I'd have any clue what's going on. So for me, just as someone sitting down now, and certainly it's funny though because you go, oh well, you could say, well, try this or what about this. So maybe that is something that is there that's available as an outside eye kind of thing. But I really got this shaping, this idea of this, and that's the repetition and the reflection of what you're doing. Once it's done more than once or twice, or then you start to, it becomes ritualised and it starts to cause an imprint, and then energetically what you're doing is causing this imprint on the floor. There's something, you're on the money there about cytonics and the shape of sound, and I think you've hit a really important point when you talk about the shift. You know, when you went to dance outside, you go, oh, I don't have the same push, I don't have the same thing. And if you're wanting to be able to capture those true things, that it has to come from country. And then, so you have to dance on sand to know what it feels like to dance on sand, the burn and all of that, and the heat and the textures and the grip and that kind of thing. There's always going to be that question then about how does it then get lost, or how do you keep it when you bring it back into a studio here? So again, it becomes an embodied knowledge. So having someone else attempt to edit that, had they not been in there, maybe there's something there about a dramaturg that's in there learning the thing as well. You can only edit if you know the story, you know.
Yeah.
So there's definitely something there about the physicality of the script, and that's two different things than if the script's already written or if you're creating a script. Certainly, if you're sitting there, right, creating your dance work, maybe there's somebody there to help you shape things. But as an editor, there's some.
When working with stories not ours alone, we as the Indigenous creative accept ultimate accountability for what projects we involve ourselves in. We recognise our individual stories to be bound eternal to the collective stories of those walking before us, and to those walking now, and to those walking with us in the future. Vitally, we must make informed choices as to what aspects of Indigenous Australian cultures we respond to and what we choose to make explicit in our works. The preservation, interpretation, and presentation of story is crucial. Much is unspoken, and necessarily so, for the straightforward fact that we are not a literal modality of storytelling. And herein lies the reckoning, the balancing act between investigation and respect of culture. We ask, who are you to this work? And what is this work to you? If anything, we are story feelers, story holders, story sharers. To physically realise an Indigenous Australian story is deeply personal and collectively felt, regardless of whether the story came from within you or found its way to you. To comprehend that you are equally story and storyteller is crucial. Indigenous Australian stories expressed through dance may be taught to you, gifted or given permission for. They are remembered, researched, revived, reimagined, recreated, and beginning today for the first time. They may emerge out of a response to a specific design or patterning particular to a place or people. Our dances can be sweet, liberating, gut-wrenching, quirky, snippy, magical, serious, tragic, hilarious. Ultimately, we know that different stories demand flexibility in how they'll be approached, received, and shared. However, it seems perfectly reasonable to suggest that if one is going to go telling a story, they should at the very minimum, 1, know the story, and 2, accept all consequences that come with telling it. So we ask, who is this person, and what are these processes to steer us in our own art and technique of dramatic composition and theatrical representation as storytellers? Where do they get their authority? Where do they get their permissions? Relationships to country, community, and culture really matter, for they direct how we as Indigenous Australians conduct ourselves both on and off stage. Any perceived dramatic composition in our work is due only to a metaphoric exposition of these relationships, and results only from the manner in which they are creatively engaged with to reorder within existing relational structures. We as dancers and dance makers must add and not detract from what is already there. What is this work to us? Participants have revealed some key considerations in how dramaturgy can help to decolonise our stories by situating First Nation Australians at the forefront of First Nations Australian storytelling in the first place. These are: who are you? What has this work got to do with you? Why are you creating or dancing in this work? What is its purpose? What is it for? What is this story? Where is it from? Is this a personal, cultural, universal response? Where are you creating this work? Where will you perform this work? When and with who? What are your responsibilities to this story, to this community, and to this country now that you're allowing it to live through your flesh and become part of your story? How do you ensure cultural protocols and responsibilities are met while also honouring individual creative voices? Who and what can you trust to help you along this journey? The answers to the questions above govern the creative process that we are duty-bound to respect. They also set out a means for expression which we will trust above all others because they are rooted in a genuine assessment of what we are doing there in the first place. The choice to work with any person or process must lie with the Indigenous Australian dance creative and reflect responsibility to all cultural knowledge explored and shared. How we dramatise our dance works is not only dependent on what oversees us, but on what underpins us, and this will always be country, community, and culture. I have mentioned earlier that trust is a recurring theme in the proceeding of this project. This is because who we choose to share creative cultural endeavours with is a multi-layered decision-making process which has far-reaching personal and professional implications. The question appears far less about whether a dramaturgical practitioner happens to be Indigenous or not, or whether they come from a dance background or not, but rather, whose voice will be amplified in the storytelling. We agree that it must always come down to the Indigenous dance creative's choice as to who is invited into the space. The ancestors dance with us always. Sovereignty remains firm. The fundamental question has become, who do we trust to be dramatising in physical form this story, this time, with these people? Who has the power, experience and permission to work or rework an Indigenous story, or to propel an Indigenous Australian body full of stories for that matter? Someone who knows who they are and who they are to the work and to the whole story? For sure. Someone who understands who you are to the story? Yes, indeed. Someone who lives the story or is part of that story or is responsible for its proper continuity and expression? Certainly this is best practice, culturally and creatively. At the end of the day, when the sun goes down, the correct support from outside the primary working bodies is helpful, vital in some circumstances, so long as this does not drive over the top of our own ideas and cultural responsibilities. And it is we who shall measure and decide who and what is correct for our own selves and our own stories. To conclude, any true art or technique of dramatic composition within Indigenous Australian dance is born from cultural responsibility. It must therefore return back to serve it. The body senses, the body holds, the body speaks. The ancestors dance with us always. We are always accountable to them.